If you were to visit the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, or perhaps the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, you might notice that they exhibit very little, or no information about the ancient peoples native to northeast Ohio. This is surprising, considering how many fascinating and well-known sites have been identified in central and southern Ohio. For example, Serpent Mound, internationally known and officially a National Historic Landmark. It has also been put on the U.S. Department of Interior's list of sites to be submitted to UNESCO for consideration as a World Heritage Site. Major cultures that seem to be omitted from Ohio's northeast include the Hopewell and Mississippians. The Hopewell tradition, dating from 100 BCE to 500 CE, stretched from Canada, all the way south to modern-day Florida with their vast trade networks. Known for their burial and effigy mounds, the Hopewell reserved burial for their most important men. Unearthed in these mounds were precious goods made from copper, mica and obsidian. It is believed that the Mississippians occupied vast expanses of land from 800 CE to 1600 CE, building mounds and using widespread trade networks that stretched from the east coast, to the Rocky Mountains and as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. Again and again the Aboriginals of northeast Ohio are conspicuously omitted from most history texts. So what's going on? Did these cultures just never venture up into the Tinkers Creek? The answer is of course, no. Visit the Tinkers Creek, and one only needs to drive or hike through the Bedford Reservation equipped with a basic understanding of Native American tools, burial practices and sense of sacred spiritual places. One can easily spot mounds, stone tool artifacts, evidence of massive terracing, and even megalithic stone constructions. In 1975 the curator of archaeology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, David Brose, published his preliminary results of an archaeological reconnaissance of the area of Lower Tinkers Creek Valley. In it, he identified dozens of sites dating as far back as 10,000 BC. He writes, in all, the prehistoric and historical archaeological sites investigated by the Lower Tinkers Creek Survey are representative of the full range of human activity within the Cuyahoga Valley over the past 12,000 years. Many of the major significant prehistoric and historical sites are still partially intact. Much more recently, Dr. Brian Redmond, of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, in a lecture titled, The Archaeology of American Indians in the Cuyahoga Valley and Northeast Ohio, quipped, quote, "You're only going to hear a very small percentage of information about, as you'll see, 13,000-year-old timeline because that's at least how long people have been in this region," unquote. Later in his lecture, Dr. Redmond states, quote, "There's lots of archaic sites in the Cuyahoga Valley. I don't know, hundreds, probably, if not more, and usually they have very distinctive artifacts. This is an example of some earlier archaic points, about 8,200 BC from this site in Summit County, near Tinkers Creek," unquote. In fact, there are many more burial mounds in the Cuyahoga Valley than in the rest of the state. Besides discovering their existence, we've uncovered the Parks and Cleveland Museum of Natural History's knowledge of their existence and continued attempts to hide them and prevent the public from finding out about them, and their locations. Now, let's take a look at some of the mysteries of Tinkers Creek. In 1980, Professor Brose was tasked with, and submitted, an archaeological investigation of the, as it's known locally, Egypt Mound, in Walton Hills, by the Northern Ohio District of the United States Department of Justice. The mound was called Egypt Mound because of its perfectly triangular shape. While he clearly states, in his introduction and conclusion, that despite there being zero evidence that the site was a historic 19th-century family cemetery, the claim prevented him from completing a carefully controlled, professional archaeological test excavation. Local history books have left this out entirely of their written accounts. He goes on to state, quote, "If there are, or may be Indian mounds upon the property in question, they may or may not contain Aboriginal artifacts. If there are mounds and they do contain Aboriginal artifacts, such artifacts may be either rare or abundant, they may be fragmentary or complete, and they may or may not display any aesthetic merit. Without determining the situation as to these possibilities by archaeological test excavation, it is quite impossible to determine any potential market value, although, unfortunately, there would indeed be a market." End quote. His overall determination was that the Egypt Mound was not a man-made earthwork. However, near the end of his report, he states, quote, "Our recent archaeological excavations have revealed that below a depth of 42 centimeters, there was no evidence in the strata or soils of cultural disturbance, that is, either there had never been an historic grave, or graves excavated at that location with the stone plot markers, or the entire area had been re-excavated and refilled sometime over a century ago. In none of the test units excavated within the historic cemetery area, was there any archaeological evidence of human remains or containers thereof. It is clear that the historic cemetery markers on the summit of Egypt Mound have been vandalized and neglected for a considerable period, and that their present location need no longer correspond with the original location of the respective graves. An equally plausible interpretation, based upon these recent archaeological excavations, is that between 1853 and 1858 the historic burials were removed or relocated. End quote. Our own independent research has proven that indeed the historic grave, that was said to be located on Egypt Mound by the land owner at the time, was in fact, originally located miles away at the site of another cemetery. All accounts of Egypt Mound being a historical family burial site, originated only via word of mouth, from the landowner himself, who also used his ancestors' last will as evidence, claiming that the site had been reserved for such, and could not leave the family's ownership. Despite this, a quick online inquiry into property records shows that the mound was bought, and sold numerous times to people outside the family. And in 1979, the United States government used eminent domain to seize the property from the owners, paying them $270,000. When I spoke with Professor Brose to inform him of our findings, he recalled to me that during his time working in the area, he was forced to work off of two maps. One with known archaeological sites he could investigate, and one with known archaeological sites along with property owners that were uncooperative and unwilling to allow him to do his research. What makes Professor Brose's statement strange is that at the time, the Egypt Mound was property owned by the U.S. federal government. It's a pity that despite state archaeologist Mr. Donkin declaring the Egypt Mound to be the largest earthwork in Cuyahoga County in 1930, the relocation of the landowning family's tombstone prevented any proper investigation, and thus Ohio has lost an important part of its history. Less than half a mile northeast, situated directly on the southern edge of Tinkers Creek, is situated an extremely large mound of earth, oriented to the northwest, and perfectly centered within a deep ridge line that surrounds it on all sides up to the river. Located next to what's now called the Hermit's Hollow picnic area, this mound is a very prominent feature in the landscape. The mound at Hermit's Hollow was once identified by local historian Joe Jasinski in one of his hand-drawn works titled, Northwest Section of the Tinkers Creek Valley, Points of Interest during the period of 1923 to 1933, and listed in Mr. Jasinski's legend. However, the map is nowhere to be found, and in all of Mr. Jasinski's officially published works, all references to the mound at Hermit's Hollow have been removed. Mr. Jasinski stated, this mound is near the former cabin site of the old Hermit of Tinkers Creek. Mr. Donkin reported that it was not an Indian mound, but of glacial origin. This may or may not be true. Its nearness to the fort directly across the creek could suggest its use as a burial site. Apart from this, the mound at Hermit's Hollow has no other publicly available history or information. The mound is frequently climbed upon, litter, graffiti and even evidence of looting are evident. Certainly this site is known to those with an interest in illegally collecting artifacts. We have attempted to contact the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, but haven't received any response. One can only speculate that a mound of this size and antiquity doesn't fit into academia's paradigm, and therefore has been ignored. Perhaps coincidentally, but there appear to be many discrepancies on archaeological maps of the area. Specifically within the Bedford Reservation. Only one map by Professor Brose shows sites not listed on the legend, but many of Mr. Jasinski's maps have contradictory, or just missing information. The Indian Point, referenced by Mr. Jasinski, as being directly across the creek from the mound at Hermit's Hollow, is recognized as an Indian fort and campsite by historians. Indian Point was first identified by the original settlers in the 1800s. Specifically, by Moses Gleason, who owned it, as well as the property on which the Egypt Mound and Hermit's Hollow are located. He reported seeing earthworks, already ancient, and in ruins. Again, one only needs to visit Indian Point, or Hermit's Hollow, with eyes open, to see the significance of the landscape, that ancient man undoubtedly also saw. So obvious is this a culturally significant section of Tinkers Creek, one can see it clearly from topographical maps, from space. The only way to visit Indian Point, without drawing a swift response from park police, is via a horse trail from Hemlock Creek picnic area. At the top of the ridge, the trail follows what used to be Button Road. Rusty old fire hydrants are the only evidence of the city's attempt to develop the land, before suddenly selling it to the Board of Parks, tearing out the road and abandoning the area. The only sign is an unusual one, warning any visitors of the countless violations they will be charged with if they, quote, deviate from the trail, end quote. Cleveland Metro Parks volunteers park their cars at the end of what's left of Button Road, near the top of the ridge, with volunteer signs placed in their windshields, and patrol the path to Indian Point frequently. Things get murkier and murkier as one moves upstream. Joe Jasinski records many sites of historic interest, as well as some prehistoric sites. Notably a site with conflicting accounts of petroglyphs within a cave. The book, Tracing Our Heritage, written about Walton Hills, places the cave near Lost Meadows. It also states that the petroglyphs are of a Turkey and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History has studied them and, quote, opinions differ, unquote. Mr. Jasinski's missing map of Hermit's Hollow Mound also includes another site that appears to have been removed from history. Recorded as only stone ruins of an unidentified old structure. Judging from its location within the legend we recovered, these stone ruins must be nearby, but we have been unable to locate them. However, Mr. Jasinski himself records the cave being in, quote, the narrows of Deer Lick Creek, unquote, which is a tributary of Tinker's Creek. He also describes the petroglyphs as of a turtle and a running bird. No pictures, or even drawings of the petroglyphs appear to exist, and the site has been lost to the public. Different maps place the site in different places along the Tinkers Creek Valley. So why is the history of Tinkers Creek so mysterious? Well, the answer is that it is supposed to be. While historians, archaeologists and officials will openly admit that the area was populated in the far distant past, they also admit that specific information is on a need-to-know basis, only. On the National Park's website, it states, Cuyahoga Valley has hundreds of small archaic sites. To protect them, we do not make their exact locations public. If you want to see the general area of an archaic base camp, visit the Terra Vista Natural Study Area on Tinkers Creek Road, near Canal Exploration Center. The Terra Vista Natural Study Area being the location of, among other things, large amounts of vandalism. For many years, it is a popular site for young people to quote-unquote party, as well as a topic of many books websites dedicated to the so-called haunted parts of Ohio, the site of a recent murder, and the actual burial location of the settler's grave desecrated in order to keep archaeologists away from the nearby Egypt Mound. Perhaps our park system would prefer we gaze upon the spray-painted, broken and stolen gravestones put into their care, then know the truth. The National Park's website also states in regards to paleo-natives, that the, quote, best place to learn more is at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. End quote. The museum has no permanent exhibit on natives in the area and, as of yet, will not respond to our inquiries. With so many sites identified near the mouth of Tinkers Creek, to the north and as well as the south, it seems quite improbable that prehistoric man never utilized the scenic Tinkers Creek or gorge. The landscape itself bears witness. We are forced to analyze what has been made available to the common folk. Thankfully, technology is progressing faster than the ability of those who wish to keep things hidden. Using a computer to process as many of the incredibly detailed, technical papers and official reports we could gather online, led to something interesting. There appears to be a consistent linkage between early Paleolithic sites, near the Cuyahoga and Tinkers Creek, along with terraces with floodplains. It is not a coincidence that in the heart of the Bedford Reservation, lies two massive terraced floodplains leading down to Tinkers Creek. Far off the beaten path, surrounded by both identified and suspected, prehistoric sites, the smaller terrace also happens to point at the northernmost point of the long Tinkers Creek, which meanders through 2 counties and several cities on its way to become the largest tributary of the mighty Cuyahoga. It is accessible only via a bridle trail, that is conveniently left off the maps provided by the Cleveland Metro Parks. At the end of the trail, lies a megalithic stone monument leading to an earthen causeway up the terrace. Along the path, the remains of ancient walls can be seen as well as evidence that much of the wall has disappeared beneath the ground and vegetation. Visible on the lower terraces are small and medium-sized mounds, surrounded with stone, and stones forming fire pit-sized circles up the path. Clearly a very ancient and sacred place, the only documentation claims that the megalith was part of a dam and mill in the late 17 and early 1800s across the creek. The rest of the structure being washed away by a surge of the creek. Early maps of the area do put a factory and dam at the location, however even if this is partly true, evidence casts doubt that the structure is of 18th century origin. First being, the stones next to, and supposedly part of the monument appear to have fallen upstream as a result of the surge. It is entirely possible that the monument was part of an 18th and 19th century construction. But if it was obviously something the early settlers found and put to good use. Undoubtedly many of the unhewn gigantic blocks which became the foundations of the early settlers' homes, originated from this site. While you and I can't get away with citing lack of evidence, as evidence. Academia will undoubtedly claim that this isn't possible, because there's no other proof of the Aboriginals in the northeast creating megalithic works from stone. Evidence that they, themselves, are the only gatekeepers and arbiters of. Considering their admission about hiding archaic sites, it isn't wise to take them simply at their word. Just downstream, lies another, yet much more massive terraced slope down to a floodplain touching Tinkers Creek. There is no modern path, and the terrain is steep and potentially dangerous. The creek shore is littered with artifacts. Not your well-known arrowheads or flint points, but ground stone implements and pottery. It is very, very, illegal to disturb archaeological sites. I do not recommend that anyone attempt to visit the places I've outlined in this video. My only hope is to raise awareness of what appears to be a large cover-up. A conspiracy to hide the true history of a small part of northeast Ohio. A history that, for whatever reason, needs to be kept from the general public. Thank you for watching. Please share this video with anyone else you think may benefit from knowing more about the hidden history of northeastern Ohio.